Hello, YouTube. This is me. Audiobook is alive. Yes, this is my voice. Because I decided to change up things because YouTube decided that my channel should not be monetized. I should not get paid for my work because I use AI and reuse content and repetitive content too. So please do go to my Patreon to support me. For $7, you will have access to all my novels I make, all my audiobook novels, for just $7. Wow, that's a great deal. Okay, and if you guys have any other advice for me to change up and hope so get paid for my work, do tell me in the comment section. Like and sub. Now back to the story. Have a good day.
Gaia looked at the reactions of the various groups and nodded with satisfaction. With this, she had grasped greater authority within the continent. Although many people had acknowledged her power and respected her claims of being a goddess, they didn't give it too much merit. After all, most of the time she was cultivating in her home, which prevented people from caring about her too much. The religion she had established, Divine Syndicate of Genesis, which had been later shortened to Genesis Syndicate, was growing, but not by as much as she'd like. But that was all about to change. She'd been waiting for a chance like this for a long time, and she finally obtained it. All it took was for her to exhibit her age and use the superior power of her soul to suppress all the others. Something that was made very easy with them having little to no knowledge of the soul, talk less of soul cultivation. As for the life forms she had created, that was a bit of a trick. No fourth real me or alive could create complete life forms with their little power, no matter what law or combination of laws they used. That kind of power was, at the very least, the domain of immortals and full-fledged gods. The seventh realm and above. Even then, it was still a difficult feat to achieve, and even if success was achieved, the consequences were almost always fatal. It was best to leave creating brand new lives to the world's and ninth realmers. What she did was create an illusion. The fake animals were running away but were still visible, but eventually, when no spirit sense was detected and they were free from sight, they would vanish. Some people here in the gathering might try to look for them, but they would find nothing. The few who actually put effort into finding them might find it strange that a newborn life form with no mana to speak of could hide from them, but if they ever came to speak to her about it, she would only tell them that she had given them a blessing that allowed them to hide in peace. If anyone was worried about some random creatures possessing some kind of stealth ability, she would tell them that she had also cursed them to live manless lives. They would live peaceful, mundane lives, and die of old age. She always planned everything out. She let the age recede out of her eyes and watched as the various bodies twitched one by one, depending on how quickly their owners regained control. She took note of the faster ones because they were the most talented, but all in all, everyone here was quicker to react than she expected. Really and truly, this world and its inhabitants were something else. Do you understand now? She asked this question to the toad that had been antagonizing her this entire time. He was visibly breathing quite shakily and it looked quite weird on a body like his, but she wasn't disturbed by that. Why yes, Goddess G Gaia. Good. Then she turned to the rest of the crowd. Their faces had changed and most were looking at her with wary gaze, which she inwardly respected since it meant that they hadn't submitted out of fear, but others looked at her with outright fear or obsession. She didn't care about insignificant beings like them. It was one thing for people to devote themselves to her out of respect for the things she did or represented, but it was another thing altogether for them to do it because they couldn't withstand looking at her eyes for more than a few seconds, causing their minds to alter. Whether her soul had been unfairly involved or not. Losers. So, before we discuss how to go forward with the war, there's something important that we need to discuss before that. A few faces twisted with frowns, probably thinking that she was going to ask for a yard after taking an inch, but their worries were unfounded. What should we call our continent? Central Continent, Dawn Forest, Elven Kingdom. The capital of the Elven Kingdom was growing much faster than other cities created by this world's inhabitants, perhaps only being rivaled by the capital city of the Eoloria Empire, City of Glory. It had streets but no roads or pavements, which was understandable since there was no form of transport that needed them, but the streets were framed by rows of buildings that were diverse in nature and even had stalls here and there. People went to and fro the middle of the various streets and the overall mood was joyful. Elves and fae could be seen conversing happily and there didn't seem to be any disdainful smirks or hidden glares. It was like the dispute between their two castes that had erupted into a war 5 years ago, year 167, had vanished. It was as if there had never been a civil war in the first place. How did that happen? In any case, things were looking much better than before. The streets were bustling, the shops were selling and the people were smiling. Everything was good. Or, well, that would have been the case if it weren't for two oddities. The first one being that on one of the stalls, the person in charge seemed to be a 13-year-old boy. He had brown hair and green eyes, the typical good looks of an elf, but nothing else. He wasn't anything remarkable. However, he was alone. A child being alone in the Elven Kingdom hadn't happened in a long time. Ever since the Fey child that had been murdered 18 years ago, protection for kids had been a special priority. So to see one trying to run a stall by himself unsuccessfully at that was very odd. The other oddity was a tall man cloaked in pristine white robes. He had his hood up, but it wasn't capable of hiding his long white hair. And where the shadow cast by the hood succeeded in hiding most of his facial features, it failed in suppressing the light generated by his irregular golden eyes. This highly conspicuous man was walking down the street as he hummed a tune, but barely anyone paid him attention. What was weirder was that for the people that noticed him, they would pause in awe, but only for a moment before their attention was redirected and they carried on with their day, as if they had never seen him. Who else could it be other than Eridel's avatar? As mentioned before, his QOB was too high for a majority of life forms to withstand, so it resulted in their brains removing him from their memory entirely. An automatic self-protection that most people had. But what was Eridel doing here, walking the streets of the Elven Kingdom's capital city? What was he plotting this time? Elven Boy POV. Gasalam sat behind his stall, watching the crowds of elves and fae as they went about their business. Some would veer off to different shops or stalls as something caught their attention, but nobody paid any attention to him, and on the rare occasions that they did, they would only give a forced smile or a short glance filled with poorly hidden worry. It was worse when they walked by his stall, saw the food he was selling, got interested, only to pale in fright when they realized just who was selling. They'd then give sloppy hellos, trying to be nice according to the fairy code that had never been dropped, and then scurry off without a backward glance as if they were running from something contagious. Idiots. He said inwardly, tuning out the "How are you doing, Gasalam? You surprised me," from some random black-haired fae lady who had actually yelped out loud when she saw him. Now, more people were looking at him, showing their faces twisted with judgment, and he hated it. Okay, maybe not all of them were showing such faces, but he knew that even if they were hiding it they were still the same. They were all just wimps who were scared of what happened to him but still wanted to pretend like they liked him. Losers. Scaredy cats. Fakers. All of them. He thought. Still though, hypocritical as it might be, he let out words that were contrary to his feelings. "It's okay, lady." With a forced smile of his own. "Would you like to buy some bread? It was made with a special technique that makes it taste really nice, you should try some." Ah, the lady let out a small sound and her smile twitched. Hee, got ya. He inwardly snickered. Moments like this were the highlights of his days. The elves and especially the fae always seemed to be in some kind of competition to prove who could be the kindest, most elegant, exemplar citizen of the fairy code. So whenever he got the chance to actually talk to them, it was rare for them to deny his requests to buy. After all, what was more noble than helping a struggling orphan boy by buying his sales and giving him money? He took advantage of this whenever he could, and he had to admit that it was one of the reasons that these people were so quick to say goodbye after saying hello whenever they were unfortunate enough to make eye contact with him, but it was worth it. At one point, he had been shameless enough to ask for free money, thinking that these noble-hearted pricks wouldn't find too much of a problem, but they would always give the same response, saying that it was bad to be lazy and that if they were to actually give him money, they would be feeding his laziness. TCH. He rued the day that he decided to set up this dumb stall. If he were jobless, how could they deny his requests for money? This is why 11-year-olds are dumb, he thought. Now he was stuck in a perpetual cycle of making food every day, hoping that people would buy, only to end up disappointed more often than not. On top of that, even in the rare situations like this, they would buy but they wouldn't actually eat or drink anything that he sold. He still remembered the first time he actually caught someone throwing the bread that he spent effort to bake into the trash. He remembered the face of horror and guilt on the man as he turned and saw him looking, he remembered the flash of fury that he felt as he rushed forward to attack, and he remembered the helplessness that he felt as the man easily grabbed his wrists and tried to calm him down. But he didn't care. 12-year-olds are so wimpy. That's why he cried that day when he got home. He was a teenager now and didn't care about what those losers did with his food or drinks. Throw it in the bin or eat it, he would never care. Not one bit. He got money and that's all that mattered. As expected, the Fey lady decided to buy, choosing 2 pieces of bread and a drink, which he secretly cheered for. He didn't mind the careless manner in which she picked them, nope. He was earning money and that's all that mattered. Thank you, nice lady, he said with a better smile. It was always best to say please and thank you. Be kind to others and others will be kind to you. That was one of the aspects of the fairy code. It was true enough, he had learned. At least, his business went smoother when he was smiling like a nice boy rather than giving glares like he used to. Time passed with nothing more happening and it was quite boring, but he didn't mind, he was used to it. There were even days where he didn't get a single interaction, talk less of an actual sale. 2 pieces of bread and a drink in one sale at that. This was a good day. He smiled as he thought about that. You should smile like that more often if you want a normal life back, boy. It's a good look. A deep voice spoke. The accent sounded like nothing he had ever heard before and for a moment he was stunned. In fact, merely calling it deep seemed to be a gross understatement. What was that word that those fancy pansies like to use, sonorous? Sonorous? Whatever. This man's voice was that. He looked up and immediately developed a headache. Wadash, he couldn't finish the word before his vision faded and he passed out, but before he did, he caught the sight of 2 golden eyes. The first thing that Gasalam felt as he woke was heat. An incredible heat that bore upon his skin like a million layers of blankets on a hot day. He could feel liquid running down his skin, sweat no doubt, and his mind was dizzy. Feeling such unfamiliar sensations, he immediately became upset, afraid and frustrated. It was really uncomfortable, not to mention frightening. But the most important thing that was driving him crazy was the confusion of it all. He didn't know what was going on. This paired with the suffocating heat and the never-felt-before dizziness, he was on the verge of crying. He couldn't even see, not because he was blind, but because he didn't even realize that his eyes were closed. He was that befuddled. Time stretched and his suffering didn't diminish, in fact growing worse, but there was nothing he could do. He didn't know what to do. He groaned with misplaced effort as his addled mind pushed him to get rid of the discomfort, but whined with despair when he couldn't find a target to eliminate. Now, he was feeling the threat of death, and as such, he began to cry without holding back. But that only lasted for about 10 seconds before he suddenly felt a wave of cool air that swamped his body and vanquished the terrifying heat. Something also touched his head and in the next moment his mind was clear. He snapped his eyes open with a loud gasp as if he had just been saved from drowning, and caught the sight of many red and dark colors. He could also hear now and finally noticed an oddly thick-sounding bubbling noise which sounded weird, but when his vision cleared a little and saw what seemed to be a huge dark mountain, dribbling a slow thick red liquid that erupted with bubbles every now and then, he confirmed that to be the origin of the sound. Where am I? He wondered with terror. Welcome to the Burning Nines, boy. A familiar voice spoke. He swiveled his head around and caught the sight of a peerlessly handsome man who was shirtless, but with a pair of white shorts and a piece of white cloth draped over his equally white hair. The man had perfect muscles, unblemished skin and glowing golden eyes. It was like he was forged by magic itself, and Gasalam couldn't help but let his mouth hang open with awe. He looks so cool. He inwardly exclaimed, temporarily forgetting his situation. Is he a Grand Elder? He certainly looks powerful enough. For some reason, he felt like he had seen those eyes before, but he couldn't place a memory. Thank you for your compliment, the man said, causing his heart to beat. Did I say that out loud? He thought with embarrassment. As for my identity, I'll leave that to your own imagination. I suspect that what I'm about to show you will prevent you from completely forgetting this series of events, since it will be important for your future. But I have no doubt that your mind will twist my image into something else for your own sake. Perhaps I'll really end up being a Grand Elder, haha. What? Gasalam asked. He felt like he was having a fever dream. I don't understand, you can call me E. The man said. And I advise you just go with the flow, it'll be better for your mental health. Ah, Gasalam lamely responded. It need not be said that he was completely lost. Everything felt like a dream. Remembering where he was, he turned around to get a better look, and really and truly, he was surrounded by nothing but dark, bleeding mountains. The liquids were bubbling and smoking, signifying its horrifying heat, but he couldn't even feel it anymore. His fear of it still lingered, but looking at it like this, seeing but no longer feeling. This just had to be a dream. He turned back to the man, wanting to seek answers for his current situation even if this was a dream. Gasalam. The boy who was born from the tree of life, possessing a first-generation body of the utmost purity, who should have been free from any sort of sin or even emotion at such a young age, strangely, almost became the first bearer of the sin of wrath 4 years ago at the tender age of 9. How peculiar. Gasalam's heart skipped a beat and for a long time he was stunned. He had never heard the term sin of wrath before, but he had a very good idea of what it could be. His mind flicked to a memory filled with boundless rage that dyed the skies red and he shivered. That was the darkest moment of his life and the end of all that was good in his life. His initial prodigious position as a first-generation elf with a great life ahead of him, snatched away in a single moment. Thinking about the reactions of his peers, their faces filled with horror and distrust, his heart squeezed once more. But he hadn't come this far by moping around in sorrow. The rebellious heart that he had grown since then snapped back with fury. It wasn't my fault. It was some kind of mistake. If you know what happened, you should know that whatever that was didn't even last for 10 seconds before it went away. Even the queen checked me and said I was free of its influence. It's not my fault. He raised an eyebrow. Oh? Out of all the people it could have happened to, it happened to you, and yet it's not your fault? At all? That's right, damn you. What is this anyway? You said I should go with the flow and you immediately bring something like that up. Are you trying to provoke me? The man stared at him for a moment, and then burst out laughing. Ha 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 ha. You truly turned out well. A great success even. It would have been a waste if you became too angry, causing you to fall to the real emergence of the sin of wrath, or if you became too depressed, causing you to be useless. This is good. What? What is wrong with you? Why won't you ever make sense? Gasalam exclaimed with a scrunched-up face. He then turned around, looking every which way, looking for some kind of error in the scenery that would prove that all of this was a dream. Some trees perhaps? Trees in a place like this would be a big joke. Alas, he saw nothing but more scorched black rocks, more smoke and more boiling red liquid. Wait. Haha. I knew it. This place looks just so realistic, so I just accepted it, but isn't all of this fake? Black mountains that are releasing smoke at the top, slow-moving but hot water. Hey, it's not even transparent. I feel like an idiot. He scrambled to his feet with triumph and looked at the man who called himself he with a gloating look. But then he thought about something and got back down, laid back and closed his eyes. It was harder to go to sleep whenever his mind was too active, and normally, he woke up from his lucid dreams whenever he started accidentally thinking about things in reality. But that didn't seem to be the case here. No matter how much he urged himself to wake up, telling himself that this was a dream, it never worked, much to his chagrin. Doing this, even if not on purpose, had always destroyed his good dreams, but now when he actually wanted to wake up, it was no longer working? As a matter of fact, the more he tried, the more it seemed like he was doing the contrary, because maybe, just maybe, this was reality. So, since he refused to accept that, he wanted to try something else. He would lie down and empty his mind, and hopefully, the dream would soon lose sense like every other of his dreams and he'd find himself in a different scenery. A more pleasant scenery. Maybe he'd dream about reclaiming his glory as a respected first-generation elf again? Not that he needed respect from those hypocrites. Still, the dream was nice. But again, forget those losers. He would never need them. Nevertheless, he kept imagining scenes of elves and fae surrounding him, their faces not shaping scorn and despise but instead love and reverence. Gasalam yelped and shot up as the voice of an unknown man interrupted his thoughts. But when he caught sight of the speaker, he realized that he did know the man. It was the damn Grand Elder, and they were still in this strange dreamland. Wow. The man spoke. What was his name again? To think you would forget this quickly. Even the twin stars of the north weren't this bad. But I suppose it can't be helped. Your age and consequently your brain is inferior. But still, wow. I imagine that if I were to appear before a child, they wouldn't even see me. Haha, maybe I'll test it sometime. The man casually spoke with his hands behind his back and a smile on his face, talking random rubbish as always. Damn it, if this is not a dream, then an illusion? Did this guy cast an illusion on me? But what would a Grand Elder like him want with me? Gasalam thought with mounting worry. The image of his being sealed away in this place for the rest of his life appeared in his mind and his heart nearly stopped. Are they done being afraid of me? Do they now want to banish me to a place like this? Is it over for me? No. The fear within him grew. What do you want? he yelled out, taking a step back. The man gave a short sigh. Honestly, I look so holy and dazzling, on purpose mind you. And yet still, everyone who I speak with always seems to think I'm a horrifying monster? The woes of being too strong. What did the pitiful me do to deserve this? He shook his head with a sad look in his eyes as if it was a great shame. You dash. Okay. I don't have much time either, so all jokes to the left. The man said before he turned around and faced the biggest volcano in the center. I brought you here because I want to give you an opportunity. An opportunity to gain a power that no other elf has. And let me tell you, if you can grasp it, not only will you get your life back, but you will also rise far above what you could have possibly achieved before, obtaining the adoration and reverence of many elves and fae alike. I don't need it. I don't need anyone. And I definitely don't need that adoration from people like you lot. Gasalam growled, trying to irk the man with his ferocity that he knew other elves and fae disliked. Unfortunately, the man simply chuckled as if his words were as insignificant as the wind. Explosiveness so uncharacteristic of an elf. Ha ha ha, perfect, the man laughed. He then looked up to the sky as if contemplating about something, then looked back at him with noticeably brighter eyes. You know, since I did cause you a lot of trouble to get you to this point, I might as well throw in an extra gift. I said I don't want Gasalam started. My first gift to you is this lava here. Elves are creatures that have an innate affinity with all nature. Well, not all per se. A single elf can only have one or two, or maybe even a few more affinities if they're super lucky, but that's not the point. So long as the planet grows it, the elves can, theoretically, control it. They just need to have its specific affinity. But unfortunately, growing up in a huge forest and developing a culture that obsesses over only rocks, trees, and water has somewhat crippled their potential. They have ignored the powers of lightning, fire and lava. The first two are more chemical reactions than things grown by the planet, so it's understandable that those who don't focus on it will have a harder time obtaining its insights, and you guys have probably never seen lava before, so it's also understandable that no one has ever obtained its blessing. There's also the problem with personalities and so forth, and it's really quite sad. Such potential but no one to use it. Very unfortunate. And that's why we are going to change that, starting with you. It's for this very reason that I forced you to nearly become Wrath, so buckle up boy, it's time to claim your destiny. Gasalam felt a headache come over him as he tried his best to comprehend everything the strange Grand Elder was saying, but when he heard the words I forced you to nearly become Wrath, his temperature dropped and his mind went blank. He stood there helplessly with his mouth hanging and his eyes shaking, the words replaying in his mind over and over again. It got louder each time, and before he knew it the voice sounded petrifyingly monstrous. It slammed against his skull with each syllable and made him fall dizzy. What did you say? He uttered. Maybe the Grand Elder was joking, or perhaps he misheard. Let him say it again. The man, seemingly oblivious to his struggles, gave a bright smile. The brightest smile he had ever seen. But the words that came out his mouth dropped him to his knees. You heard perfectly correctly, boy. I forced you to nearly become the sin of wrath. His knees crashed into the ground. He grabbed his head, messing up his hair as he tried to alleviate his pounding skull, but it didn't work. He screamed, but couldn't find any other words that could express even half of the emotions that were burning through him. It was a test of sorts. You won't remember this, but I have big plans for my eventual true incarnation. Not only do I want it to hold the powers of this planet, or at least as much of it as it can, I also want it to harness the powers of the heaven and hell that I foolishly created. So I thought, if I want the powers of hell, it would help if I started off as a single sin-bearer before I became the one true ruler of hell, wielding all sins. So naturally I thought, what sins do I like? Which one should I start with? The ones I wanted most were gluttony, lust and pride, but I could only start with one. So which one? I went through a process of elimination, and eventually decided with lust. Simply because it Gasalam screeched with rage, his hands pulling at his hair and his face twisted with malice. The man blinked, before continuing as if nothing had happened. Simply because it provides the fastest way to gain strength. Well, gluttony is actually faster, but that's only when you have enough power in the first place to obtain things that would be worth eating. Pride isn't bad, but it's a near suicidal power to have, I must admit. I only like it because I myself have a bit of affinity with the concept of pride, as you can probably guess. So lust would be best. And how does this all relate to you? You must be dying to know. I would. He said with a hateful smile on his face. It was a gentle smile of understanding, but that compassion was ruined by the fact that this bastard was the very source of his sorrow. Well, you see, I had to work out whether it was even possible to make myself become a full sin in the first place. I had to conduct a test. And naturally, as a man of efficiency, I decided to knock two birds with one stone. So I decided that I would try my best to push you into a transformation that would safely make you the sin of wrath. I always decided that I'd stop it before it fully went through, even if it didn't fail, but I'm sure you don't care about that by now. Anyhow, the test was a failure. You were going to die. And as such, I ended things then and there. Still, even if I couldn't hit one bird, there was still the other. You see, for the transformation to even have started, I had to alter your mental state to one suitable for the bearer of wrath. I'm sure you can remember your mental state in those short seconds, so I'll save you the explanation. However, even though the transformation was stopped and your mind returned mostly to normal, there were still leftover effects, so to speak. This, coupled with how people would treat you in the following years, would make you a perfect stone to hit a juice bird. I'll kill you, Gasalam said quietly. He had somewhat calmed down at this point, but he still had his two hands covering his face, only using a single eye to glare through a gap in his fingers. The man continued. As mentioned before, I've always wanted things to change for the elves. The elements of sand, fire, lightning, lava and others had been overlooked for too long, especially lava. But elements don't just need physical affinity, they also need mental affinity. See where I'm going with this? There was no reply. I needed someone who was young enough that a drastic change in their mental state wouldn't cause too much of a backlash, someone who was of the first generation, and someone who hadn't cultivated yet. And I need them to be angry. That's why I chose the sin of wrath of all sins. A sin that would give one an easy time comprehending the molten wrath of lava. All of this has led you to this day, Gasalam. This lava here is your gift. Claim it and burn me with it if you dare, and make all of your suffering worth it. I will kill you. Gasalam spoke once more, even calmer than before. My second gift to you is a mutation. When you finish comprehending lava and gain the ability to control it, I will grant you a mutation that will make you like Zalucard, a progenitor of a brand new caste. Only after this is all done will you be allowed to leave the Burning Nines. Only then will your life truly be your own. And with that, he disappeared in an explosion of light, which then reformed the man who looked at him with a goofy smile. I almost forgot. Here's a warning. Do not, under any circumstances, provoke the ants if you want to live. You're in the outermost ring of the Burning Nines and they don't often come here, but it's still their territory, so be careful. The man disappeared again, but this time didn't reappear. Instead, the protection that Gasalam had obtained against the heat vanished, and he suddenly found himself looking at various creatures not too far away from him that appeared out of nowhere, as if a veil that had been between them had been removed. Iridius world, outer space. A golden streak could be seen exiting the Iridius world as it zoomed towards the moon. It was fast, incredibly so. But although its speed was enough to make the origin of its nature a mystery that couldn't be identified with a mortal eye, compared to the distance from the planet to the moon, its speed could be called leisure. Still, who else could it be other than Eridel? At this point in time, he was the only one capable of freely leaving and entering the planet at will, so it was clear that it was him whether you could make out his details or not. But it was somewhat odd. Eridel could appear anywhere he wanted so long it was within the domain of his territory. The moon was certainly within it, so why did he not just appear there like he does in other places? No doubt, he had another agenda. As Eridel made his way towards the moon, he thought about many things at once. Mainly, the current events taking place in the world, the things he had just done, and the things he was about to do. Before he had spoken with Gassam, he had been aware of this world's very first grand conference that had taken place on the central continent and had been watching it keenly. How could he not? He was quite happy with how the event had gone and knew that it had set things in a good direction. Sooner or later, he would be able to finally create the 7 Empyrean virtues. It was a dangerous decision to make, especially as burdened with fortune as he already was after creating the 9 hells and grand heaven realm, but he had already made extensive plans to deal with fate, and either way, with the method he had used to create the heaven and hells, he was already in fatal trouble. It didn't matter if he added cherries on top. As for Gasalam, that had also gone pretty well. But he knew that there was still room for failure. If Gasalam decided that he wanted to comprehend fire instead of lava, he had a much higher chance of achieving that with his raging mentality than he did with lava. Lava was a slow, patient, unstoppable force that destroyed everything in its way. Being vigorous and volatile was more like fire and lightning. And it was for that reason that Eridel employed two methods to lower the chances of Gasilam comprehending fire and raise the chances of him comprehending lava. The first one, in order to make the second one work, was to purposely antagonize the boy, to make the boy hate him so much that he would do anything to harm him or at least anger him, such as ruining his plans. Even if the boy didn't recognize that he could comprehend fire, with the way Eridel had been telling him to be wrathful and angry for the sake of comprehending lava, for the sake of his own goals, he was bound to do the opposite, just to spite him. And with the boy being a kid, it made that likelihood higher. That's why Gasilam had stopped screaming towards the end of their conversation, forcefully trying to restrain his anger in order to rebel against instructions. But little did he know that was exactly what Eridel wanted. As the boy patiently held on to his anger, his wrath burning like nothing else but slow and restrained like a thick liquid, he would inevitably find himself drawn towards the like-minded lava currents. On top of that, if he wanted to live and not die a dog's death filled with endless regrets, then he would have to do something if he wanted to protect himself from the creatures in the first circle. Eventually, as he ran from the nth attacker, he would decide that enough was enough, he would comprehend lava and destroy all of his foes. It didn't matter if he was complying to the will of that Grand Elder because he would destroy that Grand Elder too. It was for that reason that Eridel had said the words, "This lava here is your gift. Claim it and burn me with it if you dare, and make all of your suffering worth it." He had been sowing a seed of thought. The boy, young and ambitious as he was, would really think that he could do it if he worked hard enough or got lucky enough, so when he next met the Grand Elder, he would surprise him and make him regret everything he had done to him, thinking it ironic that he would use the Grand Elder's gift to end him. Also, the words "make your suffering worth it" doubled as a way to prevent the kid from becoming suicidal out of despair. It could still happen, but the chances were lower with just those 5 words. Now some might question his methods. Why didn't he just present himself as an ally? Why didn't he just encourage the boy to comprehend lava, taking the place of someone who wanted to pass on an inheritance? And the answer to that was that it was inefficient. The mentality of someone that was carrying a suppressed but boiling anger compared to the mentality of a confused but hopeful boy. It didn't need to be said which one was better when it came to comprehending lava. That was all. Eridel had done it all for efficiency. He always had a plan and took everything into consideration whenever he made decisions. He wasn't just being a dickhead for the sake of it, although he would admit that he enjoyed acting like a movie villain. At the end of the day, everything would all benefit Gasilam. There was just a price to pay, and although it may have been painful, it would all be worth it. When Gasilam got older and realized how essential power was for those who didn't want to suffer in life, especially in this era, he might just end up thanking him for what he had done. Iridius world, outer space. The moon had changed quite a bit from what it used to be. No. It was more than just a bit. It was a lot. After all, there were trees here now. Trees, growing on the moon. The wood may have been gray and the leaves silver, but they were still trees. And that wasn't all. There was grass too, amongst other forms of plant life. And in terms of structure, it looked like mountains had been created as well. The random craters had been tidied up, and there were even lakes filled with lunar water that could be found here and there. It was AF that the moon had been trying to emulate the planet it was orbiting. The moon was watching the happenings of the world through her various followers. She had been doing so ever since her spirit sense had grown large enough to make contact with its inhabitants, allowing her to make a few of them her apostle, and she had learned quite a lot from doing so. Gains from the followers themselves aside, just being able to learn about the geography of the planet she was orbiting had been very beneficial. She had used her insights to gradually terraform her own planetary body and set it on a path that would allow for some life. Of course, there was still a lot that she had to learn, some of the most confusing among them being the sky that the planet had. It was much thicker than hers for some reason, perhaps size, and something about it was protecting the world from the hostile rays of the sun. She knew it was hostile because she could sense how much chaotic energy was within it and knew that it was something that most creatures would have a problem with withstanding for long periods of time. Those in the so-called Realm 3 would be immune, but those that made it to that state were in the minority. Trees and similar life forms were a lot more robust than the more sapient life forms, especially since they drew energy directly from her, but if she wanted to support more life, she was going to need something like the sky on the planet. Another thing she wanted to learn was magical energy. The Iridius planet released a strange energy that could be used by life forms to improve their beings, but she had none of that here and didn't know how to change that. She could absorb magical energy all the way into her planetary core if she wanted to, but that only improved her own being instead allowing her to replicate its nature. It was a little annoying. In any case, she was quite proud of the progress she had made. She had even chosen to give herself a gender. Well, chosen wasn't quite the right word. It was more that she had accepted the gender that her followers had assumed she was. Because of her apparently soft and loving nature, she had been likened to a mother. The pinnacle of mothers at that, and that's why she had been called things like Great Mother and Moon Mother, amongst other things. Initially she had ignored it, but when her anomaly stage upgraded, having a gender had suddenly become a bit important. Status. She inwardly spoke. Ding. Status. Name, Luna. Titles, Great Mother, Moon Mother, Holy Mother, Moon Goddess. Race, Living Moon, Anomaly. Cultivation, Realm 3, Stage 1. Moon Grade, Grade 1, 87% saturation. Anomaly Stage, Avatar Conjuration, Stage 2. Combat Strength, above Realm 4, not enough data collected. Contracted Apostles, Zion, Zimoy, Zekin, Zuko, Zikit, May 6th. Contracts, 8,792/10,000. Affinities, Moon, 100%, Gravity, 100%, Earth, 100%, Metal, 70%, Water, 100%, Ice, 100%, Wind, 30%, Fire, 80%, Light, 100%, Life, 100%, Creation, 30%. Elements, Earth, Metal, Water, Wind, Fire, Light. Laws, Moon, 100%, Gravity, 20%, Earth, 50%, Water, 10%, Metal, 30%, Light, 5%, Ice, 5%, Life, 5%, Creation, 5%. Intense, Holy, 70%. Innate skills, Contract, Spirit Sense, Siphon Essence, Appraise, Elemental Manipulation, Geographical Creation. Oh right, she had taken the name Luna. This one she had decided herself after seeing how most of the things that were affected by her gained the name Lunar. She just took away the R to avoid confusion. She felt it was a good decision and she quite liked it. As for the rest of her status, obviously, she had changed quite a lot from what she used to be when she had first awoken. After anointing 3 apostles, which was the limit back when she was in the neophyte stage, establishing 2,500 contracts and absorbing the required energy using siphon essence, she had broken through to the conjuring avatar stage. A stage which did exactly as it was named, giving her the ability to conjure her own avatar. It was confusing when she had gotten it, but was something she had quickly enjoyed. An avatar was akin to a second body that she could create using the materials of her true body to emulate the body or bodies of her apostles. At the time, she only had 3 apostles, Zion the lion, Zimoy the ram and Zekin the bear. This allowed her to make a hybrid of sorts using all 3 animals. However, that was not what she had done. She could have if she wanted to, and still could now, using even the races of her 2 newer apostles, but she generally didn't feel like doing so. Mostly, her avatar appeared as a female humanoid ram, complete with the horns, fur on lower arms, fur on her ankles to thighs and if she felt like it, hooves. She also used the mane of lions for her hair, their eyes as her own and added their tail onto her lower body. She had done that simply because of how aesthetically pleasing it looked, but if there was ever a need for battle, she could completely change the form of her avatar to one suitable for killing. The only thing she couldn't change was the cultivation it had, and the gender, for some reason. The avatar could cultivate like a normal sapient life form and right now it was in the first stage of the 3rd realm. However, that was quite deceptive since it could draw on the power of her main body to an extent, which was probably why her alleged battle prowess was above Realm 4. As for her gender, when she had first chosen it, she had actually been given 4 options. Male, female, male with both genitals, and female with both genitals. The latter 2 were odd since she had never seen anything like them, and she had quite frankly ignored them, opting to remain a normal female. But she kept her spirit sense lurking every now and then, waiting for the day that she could see a gender like that in reality. Anyways, another thing that was different from her origins was the holy intent she had gained. For some reason, when she had anointed her first 3 apostles on the lunar continent and established contracts with their followers, they had begun to perform something they called worship. Praising her for the things that she had done, and even things that she had not done with a zealous passion that seemed a little abnormal. Initially she had ignored it. Whether they gathered together to sing songs in her honor was not her concern. But eventually, she had begun to detect an abnormal energy that had emerged from their sessions that flew all the way into her core. It was quite shocking to her the first time. She had been of the belief that no one there was capable enough to send energy all the way to her body considering the distance, and yet that was exactly what had just happened. So maybe there was something she had missed? It was then that she remembered her mostly helpful companion, the system, and decided to ask it what was happening. Thankfully it had answered, and she was told that the energy was something called faith energy, an energy that whilst in its origin state quite useless, can be converted into other forms of energy that can be useful. She then asked the system what she should do with it, and it replied that since she wasn't a god or a myth, the best thing she should do was to use the energy to comprehend holy intent. So that's what she did. Later on she would find out that she could actually imbue this holy intent into her other forms of energy, giving it a satisfactory upgrade in quality. Something which was very beneficial to her followers. One example of that was the 2 contract skills that her apostles had. Originally, there was just one contract skill and it was called Lunar Smite. But when she comprehended holy intent, that Lunar Smite had transformed into something called Divine Lunar Punishment, and became something that could use her holy intent, becoming much stronger. On top of that, a second contract skill had appeared and it was called Divine Lunar Enhancement. It was a skill that allowed the apostle to power themselves up using a combination of her own moon laws and her holy intent. Her first apostle, Zion, had learnt the underworkings of that skill and created something similar that all of her followers could use, the Lunar Enhancement. It was a lot weaker, but she was proud of his achievement. Perhaps one day he would rise to the point that he could come visit her main body. That would be nice. Ah, speaking of Zion. He had been requesting for a long time that she anoint the other 3 leaders of the Divine Moon Syndicate as apostles, which would make all 6 leaders apostles. But unfortunately, she had been disappointing him. Well, he never acted disappointed and was always jovial, so maybe not, but she would be disappointed if she had been requesting something every 3 or 5 years only to be ignored. Her experiences with the system proved as such. Regardless, it's not that she was purposefully ignoring him, it's just that she had limited apostle slots. In the beginning she couldn't have more than 3, so there was nothing she could do, and when she entered the conjuring avatar stage, she had other ideas. She liked the other 3 leaders of the religion that provided her with so much faith energy, but she had to prioritize gains. The lunar continent had already been conquered. Pretty much everyone there praised her name and provided her with faith energy, so anointing more apostles there would be wasteful. Rather than that, she could anoint more apostles in other lands and allow them bring in more followers that provided faith energy. So towards that end, she had anointed 2 interesting apostles. One in the continent that was surrounded by all the others and another, in the sea. The first one was an interesting creature called a wasp that she had named Zikit. She had chosen that creature because of its potential, knowing that if a creature like that had qualitative upgrade it could perform amazing feats, and she was right. Sooner or later that continent would be providing her with a lot of faith energy. Hopefully, the goddess that was there wouldn't do something to harm that, but she was ready if she did. As for her 5th apostle, she had initially wanted to do the same thing with Zikit, choosing a creature that had an amazing breeding rate along with battle potential. As a matter of fact, she had done that, choosing the unique piranhas as her underwater followers, so to speak. They had risen in strength quite quickly, but one encounter with one the emperors of the sea had decimated all of them, including the apostle. The apostle had tried her best, even using both the Divine Lunar Punishment and Divine Lunar Enhancement, which had caused great damage to the emperor of the sea, but ultimately, it wasn't enough. If she wanted a sea apostle that could one day become a sea emperor, she needed something big. Something powerful. So, she chose a mutant sea centipede. It was a sea centipede that had used the evolutionary blood beast technique on a different sea beast to acquire powerful jaws filled with sharp fangs along with sturdier, more robust limbs that could from then on be used as weapons. She had named him Zuko. Before that, she had tried to make one of the sea emperors her apostles, but as she expected, they were too arrogant and refused her contract whenever they saw the requirement of eternal servitude. So she went a little lower and chose an ambitious sea king, Zuko. And he accepted. So as customary, she bestowed him with 2 laws of her own and reforged his mana with one of them, just like she had done with her other apostles. Zion had been given the laws of fire and ice and had his mana be reforged by the laws of ice. Zekan had been given the laws of earth and gravity and had his mana reforged by earth. She had made careful deductions when she chose laws for her apostles, but when it came to Zuko, she knew immediately what he deserved. And that was the laws of metal and water, with his mana reforged by the laws of metal. This created a powerful beast covered in terrifically sharp limbs with a mouth filled with peerless fangs, who not only was extremely durable, but also extremely fast in the sea, thanks to the laws of water and the shape of his body. A fast, gigantic beast who you couldn't hurt, but could hurt you, even with just an accidental brush. She had to say that he was the most capable apostle she had when it came to fighting. And on top of that, if he was mentally talented, the moon laws were something he would inevitably comprehend on his own, just like Zion and Zimoy. Though she had to admit, his mental prospects weren't all that great. He was decently smart and lovable enough, but when it came to mentality, Zicket the Wasp had him beat. She would probably comprehended the moon laws in a few years. But it didn't matter. Zuko had become a sea emperor in recent years, and all those he had conquered had been forced to praise the moon. They didn't do it earnestly, which apparently meant that the faith energy they could provide was low, but she could deal with that later. Right now, he resided in the area between Zicket's continent and the continent filled with birds, and he was getting ready for the war that would decide the next Sea Kaiser. Go Zuko! Mother Moon supports you. Ahem. Other than all of that, she herself had increased her comprehension of certain laws and improved her affinities, and right now, she was planning on anointing her sixth apostle. She had been thinking of either one of those monster things in the continent that was filled with them, or one the dead but still somehow alive creatures in the other continent. But it wasn't an easy decision. They both provided brand new prospects that she might be able to make use of. And it was just as she was thinking of that she noticed a golden light flying her way. What is that? The golden light entered her gravitational field, picking up speed and looking like it was going to crash into her. She was a little worried since the speed at which it was moving was enough to reduce it to pieces if it actually crashed, but she didn't care too much. She was intrigued by it but not enough to save it. There were some scary things on the planet, things that made even her cautious. She'd rather not have one of those on her own planetary body, so on the off chance that this was one of them, she'd rather it exploded. Alas, contrary to how it acted when it first entered her gravitational field, it began to slow down, and soon enough, it landed on her body with the impact of a feather. Well then, she thought. What is the dash, a human? The golden light dissipated, leaving behind the figure of a human with odd golden eyes, irregular long white hair, and most importantly, a profound aura of power that no other being on the planet could hope to match. All of a sudden, she felt like the understanding she had grasped of the planet had become rudimentary. Humans were supposed to be among the weakest life forms on the planet. Not because they were innately untalented, but because like most of the other enlightened races they required techniques, something only the humans in the Deadlands possessed. But even they, no, even the high humans, blood fiends and elves, the most prodigious enlightened races on the planet, were like tiny embers compared to the roaring flame that was this human. But perhaps she was jumping to conclusions too early. High humans looked like humans, but you could almost always tell they weren't at a first glance. Everything about them generally just looked better. And here, this man looked even better. The quality of all of his features looked pristine like precious metal, and yet he was flesh and blood. Was he something even more evolved than a high human? Or maybe, the progenitor of all humankind? Either way, she really hoped he'd go away. This man was incomprehensible and she didn't like that. If there was one thing she had grasped from her investigation of the planet, it was that the things that she still didn't understand, even with all of her current knowledge, were things she was better off staying away from. Still, he was here now, and there was nothing wrong with asking the system questions like she always did, so that's exactly what she was going to do. System, who and what is he? She waited a while but received no answer. System? Ding. Yes, host. So it was still there. Why didn't it answer? Was there something wrong with what she said? What is he? No answer. System, what is he? No answer. System, who is he? No answer. System? Ding. Yes, host. This was surprising to say the least. Never once had she been completely ignored by the system. Even when it refused to answer her questions before, it still replied to her, telling her she was unqualified to know the answer. But this time it was just blatantly ignoring her. Was it because of this man? An unfamiliar emotion rose within her. System? Ding. Yes, host. System, what is the species of that man? No answer. The unfamiliar emotion got stronger. System, what emotion am I feeling? Ding. Fear, host. You are feeling fear. Great. Just let him do what he wants to do. So long as it didn't harm her, he could leave in peace. Next time he came, if there even was a next time, she would absolutely not allow him to touch down on her body. At the moment it was a bit too late. Fear, she rolled the word around in her mind. It was something she had seen but never experienced. She never thought she would either. Emotions fascinated her, the way they worked. Sometimes they made sense, but other times, like this, they didn't. All it took was for the system to act in a way it never had before, and she felt fear for the first time. It was odd. If she wasn't familiar with the system and it had acted like this, she knew she wouldn't have been affected. After all, she wouldn't have known that the event was abnormal. Emotions had a wondrous way of working, but thinking that didn't lower her fear one bit. At the moment, she was dead set on pretending she wasn't sapient. Most of the species on the planet below believed that she was all kinds of things. The other side of the sun, another planet, a mere light that prevented complete darkness when the sun wasn't shining on their side. All sorts of things. But no one, who wasn't affiliated, believed that she could think like them. It had been a little annoying before, but right now, she was quite happy about the "Hello Moon," or would you prefer to be called Luna? I've always wanted to meet you but haven't had enough time. I'm a little excited. The man spoke. His voice, as expected, was also something that nobody else on the planet could sound like. But that obviously wasn't her concern. He knows. Fear surged once more. She didn't like the feeling. I know you have a soul. I know you can speak to me. In fact, I even know you have an avatar. Can I request a face-to-face conversation? He asked with a smile. The way he spoke didn't sound particularly authoritative. She had seen the way various beast kings/queens spoke, and they tended to speak rather bluntly, demanding things without care for whether the person they were talking to was willing or even capable. This man didn't sound like that, and yet, she felt like she couldn't refuse. Like there was only one option and that was to comply. How did he do that? She might have asked if she didn't feel the abnormal need to be quiet and not provoke the creature before, or rather, on her. She sighed. She didn't think things would go well if she continued to pretend to lack awareness, so she obliged the man's wishes and conjured her avatar. Next to the man, the gray soil on the floor started to bulge out as if an animal was about to burst out. But there was no such thing on the moon, at least not yet. Instead, the soil continued to rise up until it reached a height that was similar to the man's, and then it began to reshape itself. Slim limbs took form, a torso was carved out and a head appeared attached to a neck, all of this creating the basic form of a humanoid. But the changes weren't over. Breasts sprout out from the chest, a vagina was formed between the legs and the previously flat buttocks and narrow hips filled out to eye-catching proportions. This was obviously the form of a female. Next, the surface of the soil changed in texture, becoming smooth, pale in color and supple in nature. This was skin. Unblemished skin at that, shocking considering the wild material that was used to make it, but that was still the reality. Like this, more and more features appeared. Fingers, toes, mouth, nose, ears, silver lion eyes, pristinely soft goat fur from wrist to elbow and ankle to lower thigh, a silver lion tail that ended in a tuft of white fur, white ram horns that glistened like jewels, and finally, mane-like but still glossy silver hair that tumbled from her skull to her hips. Luna looked at her palms before shaking them a bit. She then rolled around her feet one by one, wiggled her toes, blinked a few times, turned her head left and right, ran her hands down her hair, took a deep breath, and then settled down. During all of that her impassive facial expression hadn't changed much, but on the inside she was happy. She enjoyed the feeling of her avatar. Having such a complex and highly mobile body was always such a marvel, and she didn't think she would ever get used to it. But there wasn't much time for that right now. She looked at the man in front of her and waited for him to speak. And speak he did. Wow, I'm impressed. You are one of, if not the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. Clearly you put a lot of work into this avatar, he said with a smile. Thank you, she replied uncaringly. But something was wrong. This man's voice. She had obviously already heard it before and it was nice to hear, but it hadn't had any effect on her when she was listening with her spirit sense and main body. However, hearing them through the ears of her avatar seemed to provide some extra effects. For one, the areas she had categorized as erogenous zones seemed to warm up a bit, especially her breasts and groin. Her nipples slowly pebbled and her clitoris trembled from a rush of blood. How? Luna was shocked. She obviously knew that her body was aroused. She had seen the symptoms of arousal appear on many females and had studied it at length, so she knew what she was feeling, but what she was confused about was why she was feeling it. It had appeared too unnaturally. She didn't even have the associated thoughts that normally created arousal, so how was this happening? Still, her face didn't change much. The physical feelings of her avatar were something she could easily ignore. But she would admit that she was consciously preventing her eyes from narrowing out of annoyance. She didn't like things that made no sense, but around this man they kept appearing, and it was causing her previously neutral feelings for the man to sour. Strangely, one side of the man's lips lifted into a grin. The bold, provocative or teasing kind, and it made her uncomfortable. It was like he knew what was going through her mind, or at least knew that he was slowly upsetting her. And it needn't be said what she thought about that. So you're capable, that's good, the man said. What? Her eyebrow twitched. Nothing ahem. Rather, I think it's time that we move on to why I'm here in the first place. Yes, she really wanted him to go away. The planet is in a bit of trouble, he said bluntly, no more smile to be found on his face. I'm sure you've heard from Zikit, or rather, the goddess through Zikit, but I'll say it for you once more. Envy is a real threat to the world, and if he isn't stopped everyone will be in trouble. Of course he knows about Zikit and our relationship. Luna thought grumpily, but she was a bit more intrigued by the topic of the conversation. Even this man was worried about the creature known as envy? Was the situation that bad? Can you not stop him yourself? She asked. I can't affect the affairs of the world anymore. It's better that you don't ask, for your own sake. The man said solemnly. So why are you here, what do you want with me? She asked. I would like to request your assistance. The man replied. The inhabitants on Zikit's continent would need extra help if they want to cross the sea and reach the Phoenix King's continent, and I found out that you're the best one to help them. Zuko, she immediately knew what he was thinking about. That's right. By the time those on Central are ready to move, the Kaiser of the Sea between the West and Central should have been chosen. I have a strong suspicion that that will be your Zuko. But still, the future is never certain and anything can happen, and that's why I too will be of assistance. My deal is this. If you can ensure that Zuko can help those on Central after the battle is over, then I can promise you that Zuko will be Kaiser. You, alone, will be the first entity to have a Sea Kaiser on this planet as your subordinate. Sounds good, right? What if I don't agree? Aya, that would be terrible. The future is so turbulent these days, I would hate for something bad to happen to Zuko. The man said with an anger-inducing grin. She wished she could send this man flying out of her main body. Unfortunately, there was nothing she could do. She sighed. I will help you. Great. The man said as he clasped his hands together. Is that all? She asked. Please go away. She thought. No. There's just one more thing. Luna closed her eyes. And what is that? Luna responded after a while. Your sixth apostle. I would like to choose your sixth apostle for you. The man said. He even knows that I have one more apostle spot left? Luna thought as she stared at the man in silence. Who are you? She eventually chanced asking. Her new heart palpitated when she remembered how the system had responded to that question, but she couldn't help but ask the man himself. So far he had not shown any hostility, so it should be fine, right? You don't need to know that right now. Perhaps, if we meet again, I can tell you at that time. The man replied with a small smile. Luna sighed once more. She had expected as much, but it was still a bit unfortunate. At least she hadn't provoked him. Whatever. She decided to move on. Then why do you want to choose my sixth apostle? Well, there's two reasons. The first one being that having a group of your followers on that specific continent would be of help to the cause. That is, taking down envy. And the second reason, which I think may be of interest to you, is that there's another anomaly like you on that continent. The man responded with a glint in his eyes. Luna's mouth dropped. She had always been keeping an eye out to see if there was another being like her. She knew that the word anomaly that was used to title her kind also denoted that she wasn't normal, she was an outlier or a mistake of sorts. That's what the word meant. So she hadn't been very confident that others like her existed. But now, this man was telling her that there was another being like her living on the planet? Who could it be? She had to find out. Which continent is this? She asked in a rush. Ha ha ha, I knew you'd be interested. The continent is none other than the land of birds. The West Continent. The man was grinning again, but she didn't care. She immediately stretched out her spirit sense to the planet, only to remember how far it was. It would take some time for her spirit sense to reach the planet, and that was not time she could afford to spend with the man right in front of her. She might end up offending him. She withdrew her spirit sense with great reluctance. But contrary to her expectations, "It's good you're excited, don't hesitate on my account, in fact, let me assist you." The man spoke before walking towards her and pressing 2 of his fingers on her forehead. She didn't even have time to resist before her vision instantly warped and a different scene appeared in her mind. It was a forest filled with large luscious trees filled with vibrant green leaves. The soil was healthy and all kinds of magical herbs could be found here and there. Alas, the peaceful scene was abruptly broken by the sound of multiple birds. One could immediately infer that there were 2 kinds of birds from the different sounds they made, and they would then be able to tell that of the 2 groups. One of them seemed to be more panicked and in pain, and the other one was relentlessly aggressive. It didn't take much to guess that a furious fight was taking place. And as expected, a large group of birds that were recklessly throwing strikes at each other fell into the scene. On one side there was a group of purgatory vermilion birds led by 2 beings in the 4th realm. The rest of the birds in that group were at the peak of the 3rd realm and weren't anything to scoff at either. On the other side, there was a group of owls. They were mostly regular, having brown-colored feathers and cultivations that varied from the 3rd realm to the peak of the 2nd. And as could be expected, they were dropping like flies. The only advantage they had was their numbers, but that didn't look like it would last long. Fortunately, they seemed to have a special leader who was miraculously in the 4th realm. A rare feat for someone who wasn't part of the 3 legendary races: Phoenix, Purgatory Vermilion, Gold Rock. The owl was a male that had gray-colored feathers and he shot out terrific blades of wind with every flap of his wings. Unfortunately, he was being greatly suppressed by the 2 Purgatory Vermilion birds in the 4th realm. His ability to command wind was exceptional and granted him a kiting advantage that allowed him to preserve his life against the destructive might of his foes, but it was all could do. The number of his brethren may be counted using the thousands, which compared to the hundreds of his enemies was much greater, but they were losing, and badly. He fought ferociously and let out the mightiest blades of winds he could conjure, but it was all in vain. He screeched with rage, but it was useless. Luna watched all of this and wondered if the peculiar owl was the one she was supposed to make an apostle. He could certainly use the help. Equals that gray owl, that's the one I want you to make an apostle, equals a familiar voice spoke in her mind. Obviously, it was the intruder. It was the first time she heard a voice in her mind that wasn't her own or the system's, but she wasn't surprised, only a little worried about what that could mean. Where is the other anomaly? She asked in her mind as if she was asking herself. But unfortunately, she was given an answer. Equals not too far from here. When you make this owl your apostle, you can ask him to find it, equals. As expected, the man could read her mind. She suppressed any thoughts from arising at that revelation. They would likely get her in trouble. She looked at the enraged gray owl and the pitiful brown ones, watching as they fell from the sky deader than dead. It was quite a sad sight. Okay then. It didn't take long for her to make a decision. She began preparations for her 6th apostle contract. The Grey Lord narrowly dodged a ball of fire by spinning to the left. It was so close that he could feel the overwhelming heat travel by him and it caused him discomfort even without it touching him, but at this point he was used to it. He flapped both wings to gain height and then flapped his wings again, this time one by one, to shoot out sharp blades of wind at both of his foes. Unfortunately, not only were they fully capable of dodging attacks as well, but even on the occasions where his attacks had landed thanks to its speed, the damage wasn't enough to cause immediate effects. In order to hit and not be hit, he had been forced to sacrifice power for greater speed. It allowed him to preserve his life against the destructive might of his legendary adversaries, but it didn't allow him to help out his people, and he was furious. He began, but then noticed a sneaky fireball that forced him to quickly dodge. He couldn't tank even a single one of these attacks or it would be over for him. Purgatory flames were no joke. After righting himself again, he shouted out once more. Why must you persist with this? He dodged another fireball and shot back with his own wind blades. My scavenge owl race has never possessed the might to compete with any of the legendary races, we don't even. He dodged another fireball, and then dodged once more. They had been trying to predict where he would dodge recently and it hadn't worked, but things were becoming more dangerous. We don't even have an affinity with an element, the power of my wind is something I obtained from a chance opportunity. You all know this. So why dash? He was forced to dodge another attack, but his climbing rage had made him sluggish and the fireball managed to scrape his right wing, singing it immediately and causing frightful damage. Not frightful because it opened up his flesh or anything, but frightful because that would definitely affect his flight. Damn it, you fiends. I just obtained a bit of power and that was all it took for you overlook all the work my race has done for your kind and sentence us all to death. Is this how you treat those that work hard for you? You legendary races are all dash. You've said enough, Grey One. Your race is doomed to perish here not because of your pitiful power, but because you dared to lust after someone you shouldn't have. She wants the doom of your race and so shall it be dash. The purgatory vermilion bird was silenced when a blade of wind struck his face. Lies. Deceit. Rubbish. Everybody knows who I am. Everybody knows who I love. I have never lusted for a single one of your evil females. This is all just a cover-up so that you can placate the other races that work for you. I'm sure you learned after what happened to the phoenixes in the pure society, so you decided to resort to cheap tricks like this. Heinous. Rotten. Wretched. You all deserve to die. Multiple attacks slammed into his back, and from the extreme burn he was now suffering they were no doubt fire attacks. I blundered. He inwardly screamed as his body suffered from the relentless purgatory flames. It didn't take much to guess what had happened. You see, spirit sense was a useful ability that allowed one to see and hear as far as it could extend. You could use it to look in all directions at once, or you could use it to focus on one particular area with a security that eyes couldn't emulate. But the problem with looking in all directions at once was that it messed with your senses. It was fine when you were standing still and focusing on what your spirit sense was perceiving, but to fight in that state was just too difficult. That's why he would only periodically let out his spirit sense to check on his surroundings, and not keep it up the whole time. It was by using the intervals between his scouts, coupled with his anger and his focus on his two opponents, that allowed the weaker purgatory birds who had been focusing on hunting his brethren to sneak attack on him. He wasn't dumb and always knew that that was a possibility, but his rage had temporarily occupied all of his thoughts. He had blundered big time, but it wasn't over yet. The might of third realmers, even multiple at the peak, wasn't enough to defeat him whether he had protected himself or not, he just need to. Boom! Something hot slammed into him with the impact of a tree and rendered him temporarily unconscious. His body caught on fire, fire that was multiple times hotter than the last, and he immediately began to plummet as his body lost all strength. He woke up shortly later with a minute gasp, but feeling the state of his body, he couldn't muster the will to save himself, talk less of the energy. He couldn't even feel his wings. His mind was foggy so he couldn't decipher whether he still even had them or not, but he knew with certainty that he was done for. It was over. His blurry sight caught the devastating scene of his dying brethren below, and the multiple balls of fire above that intended to sentence him to death before the ground could do it, and tears began to seep out of his eyes. What did he ever do to deserve this? Was it wrong to seek strength like everyone else? Is it only the legendary races that are allowed to keep climbing? Was everyone else supposed to be slaves forever? Why? I wish you unwell, purgatories. I wish your flames to go cold and your race to go extinct. I wish you to never have peace. I curse you. I curse you all dash. B-E-E-E-E-E-E-E. The Grey Lord's vision was entirely consumed by a bright silver light that seemed to have struck down from the sky. It was like a tribulation, only, it was so big that it was all anyone could see, and on top of it not disappearing a few seconds later like a regular tribulation, seemingly very content on staying, it also constantly let out a loud and shrill sound that dragged on and on. It drowned out all other sound, and soon, the strange phenomenon was all the Grey Lord could see and hear. Endless silver light and a single sound. He felt like he was dead. Was this what death was like? He thought it would have been a lot darker. Certainly more silent. Would he have to put up with this for as long as his consciousness still remained? Is this what he had been reduced to? How far he had fallen? Hate for the purgatory vermilion bird race wiggled its way into his fragile mind, but even that had to make way for the worry he had for his own race. How many were dying by the second? How many were about to join him? Oh, how he hated. If only. Ding! System announcement. You have been offered a contract by the moon. The moon would like to make you an apostle in exchange for eternal servitude, protection, and a copy of your memories. Do you agree? What? For a moment the Grey Lord was stunned. What was the meaning of this? Apostle? Eternal servitude? Even a copy of his memories? Moreover, what kind of protection could a dead mean duh. Wait. Was he not dead? System. He called out. Ding. Yes, host. What is an apostle? Ding. The host has not met the requirement for that information. Damn it. He was really tired of hearing that. but at the same time he was a little excited. All hidden information was special information. If the system wasn't willing to tell him what an apostle was, then didn't that mean it was at least a little impressive? With the notion that he might not be dead spurring him on, he almost decided to agree to the so-called contract immediately. But then a sudden thought crossed his mind. Even if an apostle is something great, that didn't mean it was great for him. It could be an elaborate term for a slave. The common language wasn't helping him too much. He could only vaguely understand that the word apostle meant some kind of special follower. But that didn't rule out the possibility of slavery. Hey, just look at the eternal servitude that was being demanded from him. System. He called out once more. Ding. Yes, host. Would my well-being be in wait? Am I still even alive? Ding. Yes, you are alive, host. But you are currently in the process of dying. It is recommended that you find a way to survive. Yes. Wait, as if I don't know that. This stupid thing, do you think I want to die? Ding. No, host. It was only a recommendation. How can I survive this? Do you have a way? I still can't feel my body. Ding. It is recommended that you accept the apostle contract. So it indeed does have the ability to assist me. I was wondering after thinking about the protection requirement. How could I protect anything if I was in this state? Surely it had a way to make me capable. But this brings me back to my initial question. Will my well-being be compromised if I accept the contract? Ding. No. What about my people? Would they come to harm because of this contract? Ding. It is very unlikely, host. As we speak, they too are being offered contracts, and many are accepting. The same contract? He didn't like how his question was answered. He would prefer a definitive no. But he highly doubted he could get much more information concerning that, so he had to move on. Ding. No. Then which one? Ding. The host has not met the requirement for dash. Alright. TCH, I get it. Fine then. If this thing can preserve my life, and even my own people are accepting contracts, then I can only accept. I need to protect my race for as long as I can. Ding. Seeking confirmation. Does the host wish to accept the apostle contract? Yes. Ding. Congratulations. You have made a contract with the moon. Congratulations. You have become the apostle of the moon. Congratulations. You have gained the heaven grade, moon apostle physique. Congratulations. You have gained the earth grade, sanctified lunar bloodline. Congratulations. You have gained comprehension in the laws of ice and the laws of wind. Congratulations. You had gained the title, the moon's sixth apostle. Congratulations. You have been named, 0, by the moon. Congratulations. Your mana has been reforged by the laws of wind. Congratulations. You have entered the second stage of the enlightened beast realm. Congratulations. You have entered the third stage of the enlightened beast realm. Zero's mind blanked out as the composition of his previously affinityless mana became reforged by the laws of wind, powering him up exponentially. And then his power surged even further as his cultivation seamlessly broke through 2 stages. It wasn't necessarily painful, but it was very uncomfortable and felt very ethereal. He felt like something soft slithering across his brain, pushing his nerves to a hyper state of sensitivity and making him feel all kinds of things. He couldn't feel his body, but at the same time he could feel everything. It was very weird. But when he woke up multiple moments later, his eyes opened and a completely different scene was presented before him. For one, the previously ordinary members of his race, the ones that were still alive at least, had all become completely different. Gone were the brown, common feathers that they used to have. Now, they all had feathers of the purest white and they glowed with magic. Their beaks were sharper and harder, going by the reflective glint they were showing like precious metals, and the same went for their claws. Their eyes had also changed color, becoming a startling silver blue, and the size of their entire bodies had grown too. His entire race seemed to have evolved in an instant. Is this power of the contract? He inwardly asked, but then he scolded himself. Of course it was, what else could it be? He didn't even need to look at himself to know that he had changed too, he could feel it. Bigger size, bigger muscles, sturdier bones and claws, overwhelming energy. He felt like he could actually mark a tree or a rock with an attack using this kind of might. As for his previous self, he felt like he could slaughter it with a single claw strike. That's how much stronger he felt compared to before. Of course, he couldn't actually damage a tree or any other planet-grown structure. It was said that one needed strength beyond the 6th realm, which was hopelessly beyond his reach. but still, he felt incomparably powerful. He stretched out his spirit sense so that he could peer at himself. And what he saw was a 70-meter-tall owl that was flapping his giant wings to keep himself floating, with the most pristine silver-colored feathers he had ever seen. They were highlighted with glowing white patterns that seemed to move with the light, and they exuded a sense of power. His claws and beak resembled precious white metal, and in fact, the rest of his face had become white too, somewhat looking like the two-tone face of a monkey, but it was his eyes that stole all the attention. Directly opposite to what had occurred to his brethren, the entirety of his eyes had become impossibly black, a light-absorbing darkness of the likes he had never seen before. And they were so scary that they frightened even him, the owner of those eyes. But this was the new him. However, although he may have those strange eyes and feathers like the moon, Wait, the moon. In his confusion he had forgotten just who had offered the contract. The demand for eternal servitude, protection and a copy of his memories had snatched his attention. Maybe a part of him had also pushed aside the word moon since it seemed to have no correlation with anything else, making it make no sense, but now. Status. He called out. Status. Name, 0. Titles, Owl King, Wind Blessed, the Grey One, Grey Lord, the Moon's 6th Apostle. Race, Serene Moon Owl. Cultivation, Enlightened Beast, Stage 3. Combat Strength, Realm 4, Stage 4.5. Bloodline, Sanctified Lunar Bloodline, Earth Grade. Physique, Moon Apostle Physique, Heaven Grade. Affinities, Wind, 100%, Ice, 100%. Elements, Wind, Ice. Laws, Wind, 1%, Ice, 1%. Innate Skills, Crescent Wind, Icicle Spears, Lunar Wind Fusion. Contract Skills, Divine Lunar Punishment, Divine Lunar Enhancement. He was flabbergasted. What was all of this? His race, his strength, his new affinity, new skills. All of this was given to him by the contract? No wait, the moon? His head snapped up to look at the night sky, but more specifically at the moon that seemed to look 100x more impressive than what it used to look like. It was brighter, more detailed, maybe bigger too. All this coupled with the contrast of the dark sky and the sprinkle of stars presented him with a sight that left him in a trance. Did the moon always look this beautiful? He couldn't help asking himself in abject wonder. What is the meaning of this? What happened? A disgusting, rotten voice entered his ears and destroyed the temporary peace he had obtained. He slowly twisted his head around and stared unblinkingly at the pair of filthy purgatory birds that had been harassing him this entire time with his new darker-than-dark eyes. They both flinched, one more so than the other, but the other one, the one he quickly identified as the dirty offender that had interrupted his moon gazing, actually continued to yell at him, although with a noticeable lack of the previous ferocity. What have you done, Grey One? What was that light? How did you do this? Purgatory Vermilion Bird POV. The owl was different. That was easy to tell. The new appearance, but most importantly the new aura, was impossible to ignore. Somehow, someway, the strange Grey One had evolved in an instant. Imoka couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine when he watched the owl carelessly gaze towards the moon as if they were insignificant, a massive contrast to the anxious and desperate manner he had been moving around earlier, but he beat down the feeling. No matter how strong the weirdo had become, there were two of them now. Josei, his partner and the more experienced one of the two, must have been thinking the same, because he suddenly started yelling at the Grey One, demanding answers. It was then that something changed in the air. A sudden chaotic violence that vibrated through the atmosphere and tore apart the previous serenity. The owl slowly turned around, giving them plenty of time to exploit him, but they did nothing. They did nothing. Nevertheless, Imoka had plenty of time to psyche himself up, and that was what he did, preparing for any sudden change in the situation, but not one thing could have prepared him for the slow reveal of those endlessly dark eyes that looked like nightmares made flesh. He jerked back in fear as his heart started beating erratically and breathing became difficult. Even Josei, his usually inexpressive partner, flinched. He decided at that moment it was time to go. Not flee, just a tactical retreat. They had already caused significant damage to the scavenge owl race and they could always come back later, preferably after gathering more information on the Grey One's change. But unfortunately, his mighty and bold partner wasn't thinking what he was thinking because he actually decided to press on. What have you done, Grey One? What was that light? How did you do this? Josei yelled out, but in an obviously more subdued manner. His heart skipped a beat and he held his breath as he wondered how the suddenly nightmarish gray one would react, but he didn't do anything. For a long moment, he just continued to stare at them with those freakish black eyes. Completely still and unmoving save for the flapping of his wings that were keeping him aloft. But then all of a sudden, his chest began to slowly expand as if he were taking a deep breath. A very deep breath. Attack! Josai yelled suddenly before charging up a fireball attack and spitting it towards the owl, breaking Imoka out of his shock. He looked into the deathly unwavering eyes of the owl whose chest was still expanding, and then looked at the dark red fireball that was sailing through the air with murderous intent, and knew that they had reached a point of no return. He could only fight together with Josai, complete their mission, and live to see another day, or suffer possibly disastrous consequences along with him. Because he could never abandon him. Unlike most other races, the Purgatory Vermilion bird race only had one progenitor. This undeniably meant that they were all blood-related, and it gave them a greater kinship than most species. But his relationship with Josai was more than just shared blood. They had been born in the same generation, only a few years apart, and had been friends with each other from the very beginning. Josai may be overly serious, overly ambitious, and get on his nerves a lot, but they had been through so much together. Just look at what they had accomplished. They were purgatory birds of the third generation, young compared to their betters, but had spectacularly reached the fourth realm. They had even surpassed some from the second generation. His instincts were hammering his skull and ballooning his heart, begging him to run from this owl that had become a menace in the blink of an eye. But even if his skull cracked apart and his heart exploded into fragments, he would never abandon his partner. He couldn't. What rotten luck, he thought as he charged up his own attack. He could only blame himself for becoming friends with an egomaniac that would look at such a calamitous change of events, and still want to fight, actually look at those terrifying eyes, and still want to fight. Madness. Even if he would admit that it was because of that madness that the two of them had even reached this far so quickly, he didn't even want to think anymore. Relinquishing himself to his fate, he blew out the ball of fire that he had been charging, causing it to tear through the air towards its target with destructive vigor. He didn't wait to see the results and charged up another attack along with Josai. Against an opponent like this, he didn't dare to hold back. Attacking an unknown aberration like this owl may be provoking death, but he wasn't going to shove his head into the other side like a fool. He'd go kicking and screaming, leaving lasting damage and obtaining small revenge, if this was really his end. Alas! Mortals can aspire, but not all dreams become reality. All he saw was the sudden contraction of the owl's chest, and then everything was gone. Everything was gone. Death had claimed him quicker than he could react, not even giving him the chance to see the attack that had ended him. And there was nothing he was able to do about it. A pitiful end. 0 The Grey One POV. So this is the power of the lunar wind fusion, Zero thought to himself. A joke of the highest grade. I didn't even use a technique, I merely released the combined wind and ice into lunar wind and released the built-up energy through my mouth. A simple breath attack using raw mana, and this is the result. Simply unreal. Zero looked at the forest below him that had been encased in ice, but more specifically the ripped-apart pieces of flesh that belonged to many of the Purgatory Vermilion bird race, which of course, were all frozen. He had released the breath attack solely in their direction, something that was made easier when the ignorant fools abandoned the owls they were fighting to try and assist their two leaders, but still, the might of the attack was much greater than he thought it would be, causing some of his own people to be caught in the attack. Without a doubt, they were dead. But he refused to shy away from the sight of their torn bodies. He would burn the image into his brain and let it torment him for eternity. That was what he deserved. The thought greatly dampened his excitement and bewilderment, making him look at his newfound power with a feeling that was parts disbelief, parts joy, parts indifference and parts self-mocking. He had gained unparalleled and unprecedented power, something that all life forms dreamed about but something less than 1% could obtain. But it had been handed to him with such ease that he dared to call it the easiest feat he had ever performed. All he had to do was say I accept, and that too in his own mind, lacking even the pittance of effort that would be needed to say the words aloud. And just like that, his desperate situation that would have become death only a few seconds later, had switched around in an instant. He, the once oppressed, had become the oppressor. No, oppressor was too light a word for what he had done. Oppressor to destroyer. That was him. All because the words I accept, that weren't even spoken aloud. How could he not look at this whole situation as a joke? My lord. Multiple voices that he recognized called out to him. He turned his head towards it and saw his remaining brethren flying towards him with various facial expressions. Of course, nothing as expressive as anything an enlightened being could show, but expressive enough to display either fear or excitement. Zero finally began to feel like giving a smile as the fact that not only he, but many others of his race had survived, but he suppressed it. His job was not done. There were still a few purgatory birds left and they were trying to flee. Naturally, that was not something he could let happen. It was because of these heinous creatures that many of his people had died, and he wouldn't rest until they were all dead. Perhaps it was too much to target the entire purgatory vermilion bird race, even with the power he had gained, and he knew that they weren't all rotten worms, so he wouldn't be like them, letting one abnormal individual set the precedent of an entire race, even if he hated them. But the ones here? They must all perish. Eridel watched all of this from the moon and gave a nod of satisfaction. He relinquished the grip he had on Luna's senses and felt not only her spirit sense focus on him, but also watched the eyes of her avatar come alive with consciousness. Good job, Luna. He spoke with a benign smile. So what do you think of your new apostle? For a little while she remained silent, perhaps thinking about what had just occurred or readjusting her senses, but then all of a sudden, the most pristine silver-colored wings burst out of her back and spread out to their maximum length, showcasing a wingspan of 8 meters and the splendor of magic itself. They then began to slowly flap, disorderly at first, but smooth as a veteran soon enough, and it was a heart-palpitating sight to see. Eridel whistled in appreciation. The wings were quite impressive. Eventually, the moon seemingly had enough and folded her new wings against her back before looking at Eridel and replying to his question. He's quite good. But those eyes. Why are his eyes like that? She asked with a face twisted in confusion. You'll find out eventually. Eridel chuckled. Just know that you picked up quite the prize, one on par with and maybe even greater than your soon-to-be Sea Kaiser. Luna's eyebrows rose, something akin to a gasp on a regular person. I see. Eridel laughed once more outwardly, but as usual, on the inside he was thinking about multiple things at once. Some were useless and casual observations like the fact that an anomaly's avatar which was essentially made of inorganic matter were actually capable of feeling arousal, and other things like his inability to read an anomaly's mind, both of which he had predicted or known before but still interested him when confronted with the reality. But there were deeper thoughts like how he planned to slightly suppress the moon and her influence in order to prevent her unfairly obtaining dominion over the world. It would have been fine if she fought her way to her position because whatever she gained would have been deserved, but as it stands, not only was she doing things revoltingly easily because of the lack of competition, inevitably suppressing everyone else, but she was also provoking fate. Albeit not enough for anything too dangerous to happen since she was doing things completely within her own ability and not with fortune, but enough that her first tribulation might go up a grade because of all the lives she had control of. Another thing, or rather, the thing that he had at the forefront of his mind, was the foreboding feeling he was sensing concerning his soul. Something was about to happen to his soul and it wasn't a rise in cultivation. At first, he was worried, because the soul was the most delicate thing about his existence and if it was harmed he was in trouble, but soon enough, which was to say less than a split second, he realized the feeling was familiar. And as soon as he realized that it must have been something he experienced before, it didn't take much for his powerful mind to comb over his memories with terrifying efficiency. And a nanosecond later, he found himself having to not only suppress his true planetary body from physically reacting, but having to keep his avatar from phasing out as well. As Eridel acclimated to his new life more and more, the amount of things that could make him react like that were steeply decreasing. The days where something shocking could cause his entire body, aka the planet, to start shaking, were thoroughly over. But he had nearly done just that. The amount of thoughts circulating Eridel's mind directly multiplied, but 90% of them were focusing on a single topic. After all, if this feeling was to be trusted and meant what he thought it meant, he would soon be witnessing the birth of his third soulmate. Eridel's avatar stood dazed, almost as if he suddenly lacked a soul. Luna blinked in confusion at the sight but ultimately decided not to say anything. She still didn't like the strange man and would prefer that he left as soon as possible. Asking him questions would only extend the duration of their conversation and that was the last thing she wanted. Thus, an awkward silence was created. Eventually Eridel's avatar also rebooted and he immediately gave a smile. Ah, I spaced out. My apologies, there are just a lot of things going through my mind right now. Something important caught my attention. Take your time. Luna simply replied. For whatever reason, the strange man was acting polite, irrespective of his power, and was even apologizing to her. But, for some reason, not only did his demeanor not appear weak at all, exuding an almost palpable confidence that dared her to try him, she felt like if she were to take the slightest advantage of his apparent kindness, she would not live to see the planet finish its next rotation. She was a little afraid, she could admit that now, but she refused to let him detect it. She had witnessed many life forms become more aggressive when they detected fear, and it almost always resulted in a pitiful situation. She wouldn't allow that to occur here. Whilst I'd like to stay longer, there is something I must do. So I'll just give you a few instructions before taking my leave. I assume you have no problem with this? Eridel asked. At last. Luna felt joy course through her along with relief, but still, her face was emotionless as ever. I have no problem. She responded out loud. Good. Eridel went through a few things with her, leaving important but subtle instructions that would ensure the overall progression of the world, before shooting off to prepare for the birth of his third soulmate. Of course, not without checking who Luna's own soulmate was. There was no way he wouldn't check something like that, even if the matter of his own soulmate hadn't arisen, and he'd be a buffoon of abnormal proportions if he didn't. Which, all life forms with intelligence would surely agree, was the furthest from what he was. In any case, the result was cliché. It was something that anyone who had read or watched a few fantasy stories could predict. Anyone with the most basic understanding of yin and yang would be clapping with glee, and a certain country back in his birth world would be crying tears of joy as they prostrated themselves with reverence. How amusing. Although Eridel had been hoping for a more unique result, this was fine too, so he threw the matter at the back of his mind, of course, along with a few potential plans concerning the matter, and focused on his own soulmates. His first one was the pink gaseous planet he had found a while back, who would be entering his domain in a few years. He thought of that planet all the time and had made ample preparations for her arrival. His second soulmate was the ex-abomination of the North, who was now living a new life as a human under the care of Gabriel and Sarakiel, and would be the heir of one of this world's greatest forms of magic and martial arts. Of course, she was still very much an apocalyptic slime and very much not a human, but nobody needed to know that right now, not even her. As for his third soulmate? Apparently, he was about to find out. There were numerous possibilities about her identity, but there would always be a single constant, regardless of what she turned out to be. And that was that he would not allow anything to go wrong. In the past, he had let matters spiral out of his control out of carelessness. There was Azura, who ended up obtaining 4 Demon King armaments. There was pitiful slime that fused with 2 Domicus treasures and became a world threat abomination, and there was even an entity that had inherited many of his own abilities as a planet and became the first anomaly. All of this had been because of carelessness, but it was more than that. For one, there was the foundation that allowed all others to exist, his previous fragile mindset caused by the 2,000 aching years of loneliness. It had caused him to overly dote on some of his inhabitants and ignore certain flaws, something that allowed the existence of things he should have eliminated as soon as he saw them, like Ghost, Gloria and Sierra, and had even caused him to adopt one of them just because she had called him daddy, namely Sierra, the first anomaly. Now he would admit that he didn't regret the choice that he made, but instead the stupidity that had caused the choice in the first place. Thankfully, with the events that established his will fire in his tribulation, that deplorable mindset had vanished. But there were still other issues that had thoroughly made use of that previous mess. For example, the will/ego of his planetary body that exploited his fragile mind, caused him to make foolish and suicidal decisions that no healthy person would ever commit. This problem had been alleviated some because of the creation of his will fire, but it had already caused a lot of damage. It had caused him to do right things like overloading his planetary core for the sake of creating magical energy, creating a world tree to use as a gift that he gave to the elves, and later on even creating 2 self-growing and nigh-independent realms, heaven and hell, something he would dearly pay for if his plans regarding his avatars were to fail. Another thing that had exploited his previous mindset was the let the world progress on its own, it will be more fun to not interfere attitude. This had been the giant nail in the coffin, allowing him to shrug his shoulders and laugh at the creation of existences like Azura, the abomination of the North, the High Human Queen, and even the Devil race. Ignoring them in hopes that he would see a way that the other inhabitants of the world would grow to deal with them. Unfortunately, whilst the idea wasn't a bad one, with all the things he had been dumping into the world in such a short time frame, the so-called balance between order and chaos had been greatly tilted in one side's favor, and it was not order. The 7 deadly sins, the sea creatures, the South Continent, the North Continent, the rising ghost problem and so much more. There was even another growing problem that was even bigger than the devil race, a new group of creatures that could barely be categorized as a single race, the group that had arisen as a result of his previous hybrid experiments using monsters, the chimeras. And guess what he had thought about it when he noticed it? Whoop, guess the South Continent and the surrounding area will be in trouble for a while. Knowing fully well that it would cause damage to many more areas if there was nobody to stop it given enough time. Eridel didn't even have the energy to insult himself, he quite frankly didn't even want to think about the matter anymore. All of this was behind him now. Slowly but surely, he would restore the balance in his world and allow the forces of order to reach a point where it could contend with chaos. The 7 Empyrean virtues would be arriving soon, and more to come. Eventually, the purely good forces of the world would be more than just the twin stars of hope in the north and perhaps the various races on the central continent that had a greater moral system than the rest. With all that being said, whilst he had allowed mistakes to occur in the past, they would not repeat themselves with his soulmates. How he would treat them when it came to that was up in the air, but regarding their livelihood, there was no room for error. If he had to, he would utilize the gigantic computing power of his mind to solely that purpose, something that not even his most prized creation, the Eridel system, had received. 3 minutes later, Eridel had already dispelled his avatar and was waiting for his third soulmate's birth in his most natural state. His every instinct was taut and he was ready to act at a moment's notice, which inevitably caused the way he saw the world to slow down to agonizing levels of slowness, but in this moment he certainly didn't mind. He looked at everything that he was capable of looking at and made thousands upon thousands of calculations on points of weakness that he made sure would not be a problem, at least in that moment, if they suddenly developed into worst-case scenarios. Of course, even if that did happen, which was too unlikely, he would only care if it happened to take place near his third soulmate, or any other of his soulmates for that matter. If not, then it better be something that he could sort out in simulation to the birth of his soulmate, because otherwise it could wait. Now, he knew that he was statistically overreacting. His third soulmate was about to be born, not undergo a 1/1,000,000 chance of survival evolution like his second naughty soulmate. Technically, he shouldn't have to do anything. The amount of times he had needed to interfere with someone's birth could be counted with a crippled hand, which is to say, 0. But there was a first time for everything, and Eridel was a firm believer in being ready so that he didn't need to get ready. Besides, fate worked in strange ways. Perhaps, his third soulmate would cause an unfortunate commotion during her birth, requiring his assistance if she wanted to live longer than a month, and if fate had plans for her, which was all too likely to be true if she was going to come close to him in potential, then maybe fate was putting paranoid thoughts in his brain, warning him about something that was to come so that she could survive until it was done with her. It could be something as simple as her mother dying after giving birth when the father was already gone, something which would spell doom for any newborn life form in an era like this. Or it could be something as annoying as her birth causing a commotion on the level of a sin coronation. Or maybe she would be born with a special constitution that required a special resource to sustain that only he could create for her. There were many possibilities, even if they were all unlikely. He had already scanned all pregnant bellies and saw nothing special. Well, nothing special in comparison to him. So whilst that was a little worrying, at least it narrowed the possibilities of death upon birth. Only natural life forms faced countless threats like that. As for his soulmate? It was becoming increasingly likely that it was another anomaly, or something similar. But which one this time? It was impossible to guess. All he could do was wait. It was unfortunate since in the state he was in he could almost count in the zeptoseconds, but it was better than the consequence of not doing so. Conclusion: nothing changes, keep waiting. And so he did. It was after a minute had passed, specifically 67.9327498324238 seconds, that he suddenly felt something in his soul, something familiar. A certain connection had locked into place, and with it came an inexplicable feeling of bliss. He absolutely knew this feeling. All of a sudden, his third soulmate had been born and had already established a connection with him. He had not seen any special baby enter the world, and there was no new anomaly either, at least not within his vision. But apparently his third soulmate was currently alive and out there. He didn't even bother to recite how impossible it was that he could have missed such an event. All he had to do was look through his new soulmate link and see who was on the other side. And to be honest, he had strong suspicions of her identity considering what had taken place at the same time of the soul bond, but if it was really that thing, then he really needed to re-evaluate himself when it came to his apparent tastes in women. The first one was an uninhabitable gaseous planet that was so hazardous that it would reduce most life forms that got close to it to dust. The second one was an apocalyptic abomination that had not only become a chaos being but also the sin of gluttony. The amount of lives it had casually harvested when it was just an abomination spoke for itself. As for his third one? It was, of course. It was none other than a horseman of the apocalypse. The horseman of death, to be exact. The horseman of death had finally devoured enough souls to complete her own, something that he had been looking at, like everything else, but ignored, opting to keep focusing on the birth of his more important third soulmate. But as it turns out, as soon as Death's soul had been completed, it had gained the blessing of the Iridius world, something that every other soul in this world had. Which is to say, the system, the soulmate link and other smaller things. Who would have guessed that that soulmate would tie to him? Eridel was rocked. Once again, he had failed to predict the identity of a soulmate that had been right under his nose. But how was this possible? The horsemen were powerful, but none of them could match the potential of the slime abomination, talk less of him. So how could any one of them become his soulmate? It didn't make much sense. But that was only if you looked at it without considering future possibilities. Eridel didn't even need to think too much to guess just how the horseman of death, his third soulmate, was going to match him in future. He could already think of a very important position within his own world that would greatly augment her potential if it was to be claimed by her. Thing is, he had been planning for that position to be given to someone else, the Wraith King to be specific. He had never considered giving that position to be given to the horseman of death despite her affinity, because as a horseman, her job was to be outside his world, roaming the universe and marauding for opportunities. Not sitting down to govern that place. But honestly? It's not like she couldn't do both, it's just. Eridel would face palm if he could right now. What a nuisance. His third soulmate had just been born but was already affecting his plans. He could only hope that the soulmate system would truly do its job, and make her an upgrade to his life, not an anchor. Either way, nothing was set in stone. Right now, he would much rather loosen his thoughts and just watch his new soulmate for a while, even if she was a multi-wolf-headed death ball. A giant, multi-wolf-headed death ball. Lowly galaxy, desolate region, Mayanka world, a ruined city. Lying silently on the road of an abandoned street was a highly conspicuous egg. However, the only thing egg-like about it was its shape, but honestly, anyone looking at it would rather liken it to a strangely smooth boulder. A very evil one at that. After all, not only was it very large, roughly the size of a car, and lacking any semblance of softness, but it was also very paranormal in its color. It was a haunting pitch black that seemed to absorb all light, and the only saving grace were strange gray patterns marking its body. Beautiful in appearance but eerie in nature. The object was obviously bad news, and any mortal with intelligence would have made the smart decision to skedaddle, whether they had knowledge of magic or not. Even the adrenaline junkies who braved perilous situations in order to discover the secrets of the universe would have made the smart decision to run away, and they didn't even need to look at surrounding ruins of what was once a beautiful city to make that decision. The aura of death surrounding that egg was just that bad. Crack! All of a sudden, a distinct cracking sound was heard above the roar of flames assaulting the city. Asterisk crack. See crack. Crack crack. TSSSSSSSSS, asterisk. Further cracks could be heard from the egg and it sounded like it was about to hatch, not that it could be seen, the egg was too dark to detect any cracks. But soon enough, a hissing sound could be heard as what looked like black smoke seeped out of the cracks and billowed into the air with notable velocity. CSSSSSSSSH. A while later a different sound was heard and the egg suddenly shattered, releasing what was hidden within back into the world. The horseman of death. Breaking common sense, the black smoke that had congealed together to form the rough shape of an oval ball had reached an imposing height of 10 or so meters, something akin to a 3-story building. Had it been compressed within the egg the entire time? Either way, that observation wasn't the most shocking thing about its terrific appearance. Taking that position were the dozens of phantom wolf heads littered all over its vaporous body. Those things were the stuff of nightmares. They disappeared and reappeared in different locations erratically, and the killing intent they expressed within their eyes and horrible growls was blood-curdling. And yet, not a single sound could be heard. They looked like they wanted to devour the world and everything within, eyes chaotic with ravenous hunger and lips pulled back in despicable snarls, but they didn't make the slight sound. The horror could not be fully expressed with words. However, as time passed, something seemed to change. The wolf heads seemed to be calming down. Their movements were less erratic, eventually appearing even casual, and although their eyes still looked like portals to the underworld, they looked less furious and chaotic. More passive, as if they were still made for destruction, but weren't actively seeking it. Their mouths had mostly settled down too. Some still gave a snarl every now and then, but for the most part they were settled. Something had obviously changed. But what? Death POV. Death cycled through the thousands of memories it had inherited since its birth. Memories of all kinds. They were all incomplete and rarely displayed a long enough story, but with the sheer amount of them it was enough to come to a comprehensive understanding of this world, and the exact situation it was in. These were the memories of the many it had devoured. The memories of the deceased that had become the nutrients to fuel its growth. Since the dawn of its existence, it had been collecting lives and collecting memories. Nothing had changed in this regard and it likely never will. The memories had only ever been used to enhance its hunting methods or locate places that many life forms gathered at, but having just completed its first evolution, the way it looked at those memories had undergone a groundbreaking shift. After all, the creation of its soul had finally reached completion. Before this moment, the only desires death had were biological, and the only thoughts it had were how to satiate those biological desires, mainly the desire to eat and the desire to grow. It could identify that many of the life forms it ate were different and reacted to life based on a much greater amount of factors outside of simple biological desire, something the humans called emotions, but they all seemed like fruitless acts. Death couldn't count how many fools it had seen carelessly commit to acts that ultimately ended up with them landing its stomach. There were some that purposely consumed poisonous liquids or poisonous supplements that dulled their senses and damaged their ability to think before they walked home in the middle of the night as if they were safe. There were some who went out running, alone at that, because of motivation. And there were even fools that purposefully sought out danger because of the thrill that it gave them. Death had categorized the behavior of people like this as the behavior of fools, a word it had learned from the humans, but not because it had never looked down on them. That would require pride and emotion. The word fool was used to describe someone that acted unwisely, and such fools were just easier prey to find and exploit than their peers. Why they acted like that, Death had not known. Perhaps it was a defect or the results of a mind-altering plague or drug. It had once eaten an important person and found out information that would make the rest of the human race break out with rage, and that was that amongst the antibiotics that they were made to take at birth, a few of them carried heinous designs that had detrimental effects on their biology, permanently changing them and their future generations in order to suit a specific purpose. Humans who were in positions of leadership had actually done this to the rest of their race. For what, Death had not known. Why not just focus on eating, drinking, sleeping and procreation, their main biological needs? It was odd. A conundrum that Death had been incapable of comprehending. But that was in the past. Death had gained a soul along with greater intelligence but most importantly emotions of her own. And now, she knew it all. Having gained a soul, the first thing Death had done had been to construct her own unique identity. Not necessarily because she had to or even wanted to, but it was an inevitable process that took place the more she perused her memories. With emotions, there were things that she saw in her memory that she felt she had an actual affinity for, things that she actually enjoyed looking at. An impossibility that had become possible. An example of this was when she had looked at the difference between the male and female gender. Having corrupted many souls and grown a large army, something that could also be called her family, she had likened herself to a mother. And shockingly enough, she had actually begun to feel fond of them. That, amongst other things like the fact that the first life form she had devoured was female, which had caused her to be more feminine until she obtained the thoughts of both genders, was the reason she had ultimately chosen the female gender, something that would become important in the fourth realm. Emotions were really interesting and complex, but it wasn't all positive feelings, almost the contrary. There were many things within her memories that she disliked and despised. The world around her was really jam-packed with inferior life forms, and even though she had known that before, now she felt it. After all, not a single one of those flimsy things had a speck of mana and they all died with a single attack. Thinking like this, it had become very quick for her to quickly feel what humans called arrogance, but she didn't care. Arrogance was only shunned because it blindsided you, making you think that you were more invulnerable than you actually were, on top of the fact that most people hated to be looked down on. But that was for them. She knew that she had not come from this world. She had meager memories of another that was many times greater than this world, and she knew that she was here on a mission. She didn't know who had sent her, perhaps it was her parents, but she didn't really care. The end goal of her mission was extremely beneficial to her and she was going to complete it. Arrogance would not be blindsiding her. She was very aware of her capabilities and her limits and had no shame in admitting any of them. She was not yet invincible in this world and that would not be changing anytime soon. Talk less of the guardians from the so-called Segothia world, something that she had known about since birth. If these humans started to launch artillery at her, she would die. As someone who had just entered the second realm, it wouldn't even take a nuclear weapon. She may have openly committed slaughter in a human city, but she had only dared to do so because she had known that wherever she stepped, technology died. She didn't know why, but in her memories, there are many moments of fleeing humans trying to contact people using C-cubes or whatever other gadgets, only to find out that they had inexplicably ran out of power, refusing to operate. The capturers and all other technology were the same. Wherever she stepped, technology died. She had previously thought that it was some kind of innate power of hers, but now she wasn't too sure. She knew what her powers could and couldn't do and they had nothing to do with technology. Either way, it still happened, and that was why she was here. Otherwise she would have never left the forests. Having devoured every life form in a few of the city's districts, she had finally obtained enough life essence to convert into the energy needed to enter the second realm. A monumental feat that humans would envy, if they didn't know how she had achieved it, but she wasn't all that happy. 15 years. That was her age and how long she had been on this world, and yet it was only now that she had reached this milestone. How embarrassing. But it couldn't be helped. Amongst her various prey, none of them had any mana for her to siphon. It also didn't help that the world itself had no magical energy, so she couldn't even absorb anything from the air like she knew she could if she was in another world. The only thing she could do was inefficiently convert the vitality, life essence, of her prey into mana, and it was very annoying. See? Most of the emotions she actually felt the more she thought about what she had experienced and what others had experienced were negative. It would have worried her if she knew she wasn't like most other life forms. When they get a vast amount of negative thoughts, they start to slow down, or lash out and then slow down. They begin to ask themselves if living was really worth it. That would never happen to her. She was fundamentally too great. Also, she was hungry. A part of her felt the tiniest bit sorry for what she was about to do, another thing she had never experienced before. It's just that there were all kinds of innocent humans and other life forms that had interesting aspirations that didn't deserve to die, and yet they were going to end up dead at her jaws. It is inevitable. The world is mine to claim, she thought to herself. However, even she could see that she was nowhere near as violent and as erratic as she was before. The wolf heads all over her body perfectly represented her emotions, and just the change in their demeanor was a telltale change in the change of her own mindset. But that did not mean she would stop killing. Not in the slightest. Everyone in this world would die if they didn't somehow leave it. She just wasn't as one-track minded as she used to be. Her soul had freed her from her instincts to an extent and now she could care about more than just her next meal. It was wonderful. But in regards to this planet's life forms? The most she could do was increase the souls of those she corrupted, instead of specifically choosing only the talented, giving them a new lease on life. Ah, speaking of those souls. Rise. She commanded, her voice echoing out of the multiple mouths on her body, but carrying a distinct femininity that was previously lacking. A second later, every shadow in her vicinity began to morph, wiggling strangely before woven heads began to form, their dark eyes gleaming as they looked at death. Naturally they didn't stop there and soon hopped out of their respective shadows and revealed all kinds of transparent vaporous bodies. We rise. They all simultaneously responded, and the streets echoed with those two words. C-cubes, short for communication cubes, are this world's version of a phone. Viscapturers are cameras. When Death first spoke, it was mentioned that her voice was feminine. But that was lost after her thoughts became mixed with both feminine and masculine memories, making her voice more androgynous. Now, her voice is once more feminine, and will stay that way.